One of the great things about the design of the NSTIC project is that it gives us the opportunity to leverage stuff that's already been created and design things that will meet needs as they evolve. Right now, there's two ways to handle security and privacy. You either let one company or one regulator or one portal take all your stuff and you're in their hands and that's the end of the story, or you need to work out cooperative methods where a variety of companies and individuals and agencies can share data but do it in a way that everyone understands is consensual and that's clear to the consumer. That's why open standards are central to a privacy and identity strategy. And we need to be able to do things with more than one website and more than one agency and more than one government so that consumers can come to a variety of places and know what they're getting into.
We believe, as I think the NSTIC program folks believe, that it is going to be private industry that will drive the adoption of the strategy throughout. Actually, I mean, I know we're starting in the United States, but I think that this is going to become a worldwide phenomena. I think it's going to address a lot of issues that the government alone cannot address, and that you're going to need the innovation and the market know-how that the industry will bring to the table.
When it comes to the role of the government, we really think of it in two separate ways. Number one, we don't want it to be a government-run identification system. We like the idea that it leaves it to the private sector, and hopefully it will become a market where there will be 1,000 flowers blooming and not dominated by just a few key top players. On the other hand, we do want to see an active government role in protecting the individual and enforcing good privacy practices, which the private sector left to its own devices, probably doesn't have the incentive to do, because our personal information is really worth money. And in the capitalist system, companies don't leave money lying around the table, they grab it. And so sometimes you need to set restraints in place by the government on behalf of individuals so that we can have the benefits of this kind of a system without it becoming a feeding frenzy over our personal information.
I think the future is the thing that scares a lot of people. I think some people see a future where there is one credential and it's a big brother scenario where you use that credential everywhere, and I don't see that happening. What I see is a case where people choose. So they choose to align certain websites and certain activities in their life along a certain organizing principle, and that people will have multiple organizing principles, and that people who don't care about privacy, don't care about anything other than perhaps convenience, they are free to take one credential, use it everywhere. At least at that point their password isn't being phished. So they get some security benefits from it, perhaps not as many privacy benefits as others who may choose to use multiple credentials in multiple situations, specifically to try to prevent correlation and that sort of thing. So what it gives people is an organizing principle that they can use to be as paranoid or as trusting as they wish. In the meantime, you've also got all of these security mechanisms that are coming into play, and as well these rules of conduct that websites have to follow, and all of that, no matter how simplistically the end user uses the system, they still have protections that today they don't have.
You have to be able to develop an identity ecosystem, and I like that term, so that you can prove who you are and who you're not without just kind of opening up your robes every time and showing everything about yourself to demonstrate that, for instance, you're old enough to buy a bottle of beer at a convenience store. The way we do identity in this country right now amounts to having almost unfettered, a lot of people having almost unfettered access to all of your personal information just so they can determine who you are, to then usually conduct other transactions.
When you look internationally, there's quite a divergence of views in terms of how to view identity. Some governments, particularly in the EU, take a national approach and are focused on developing a national identity card run by the government, where the information is collected and centralized by the government. Here in the United States, we're taking absolutely the opposite view. The government does not want to be in the identity business. It wants the private sector to do that. It wants the private sector to run the program, wants the private sector to issue identity credentials, It wants individuals to have a choice of which private sector entities they may want to use in terms of obtaining identity credentials. And the government, in effect, wants to be a relying party where it will just rely on identity assertions from the private sector. At the same time, the government has a role in terms of ensuring particularly privacy protection for the individuals involved. The term identity ecosystem, I think, has caused quite a bit of confusion. We've actually spent some time within the ABA looking at what that is and what it means and how it is defined. And basically, we think of it as what some have referred to as the tools and rules involved in an identity process. And that is the setting out the standards, the technical standards, the process standards, the legal standards, the legal requirements, all of the basic things that are needed to make the system work and to make it work in a way that is considered trustworthy by the participants, so they're actually willing to participate and to rely on the whole process.
So we talk about an ecosystem for personal data, for identity, for security, and for privacy in general. I think there are two ways of thinking about this use of the word ecosystem. One is we don't know the proper ways to describe markets with more than two actors, so we just call it an ecosystem. I think it's possible, but I'd like to think there's actually something more out here, which is that an ecosystem represents a legitimate different model of interaction between government, between different private sector actors who have to both compete and cooperate, as well as participate in different forums, both informal contacts, formal standards bodies, working through the government. And I think actually dipping back into the social science pool to look at complex adaptive systems theory, to look at ecological modeling, to look at environmental modeling, and to really dip into other intellectual tools is going to be critical to understanding not only the governance process, but some of the key policy and technology approaches that the NSTIC model should take.
So in the discussion of the World Economic Forum, which includes the heads of all the major IT and wireless and heads of most of the regulatory bodies in the US and Europe and elsewhere, one of the core questions that was hardest to solve was, who can we trust to hold this data? Is it the government? Is it a not-for-profit entity? In the end, it was felt very strongly that the only people we could trust to hold this data were the individuals about whom the data is, right? The people themselves. And that there should be a competitive landscape for personal data vaults that you can choose among for holding your data for the greatest safety, your greatest comfort, and that it shouldn't be a legislated single solution. It should be a competitive solution. It shouldn't be the government. It might be certified by the government, but not only by the government, also by many other entities, which gets back to this notion of a trust network, where the data stores, the schemes for using the data and sharing the data are all things that can be certified by distributed trust authorities, so that there's competition among not just the data stores, but also the certifiers and the people offering services to give the individual the best deal that they can get.
One of the many great things about NSTIC is it envisions an ecosystem. And if you think about this metaphor of an ecosystem, it's really quite an interesting conceptual organizing principle. What it suggests, among other things, is that there are many players in the ecosystem, and that while they have sometimes divergent interests, they fit together within an environment where all of them can thrive in general, and where the environment can evolve over time in a healthy manner, going through the cycles and seasons of change that all ecosystems do experience. An ecosystem, while similar, has some distinguishing factors from what I can think of as a market. I would imagine an identity ecosystem would support and enable many markets for different identity services to spring up and to succeed. But the notion of the ecology suggests, among other things, that there's an interoperability, not only at the technical layer, but also that there's a kind of a market-based business interoperability, so that the different service providers can actually discover and find each other, and that there can be sufficient incentives economically for them to work with each other within, again, a coherent scheme. but also a legal or a policy interoperability, if you will, so that these trust frameworks and these multilateral agreements and the other sources of rules from the accreditation and certification and the trustmark solutions that the NSTIC strategy envisions can work across sectors of the economy, across lines of business, across different segments of our society, that we get a policy, a business, and technical interoperability that comes together to comprise the coming identity ecosystem.